Okay, so what do you think is the most difficult thing for the majority of people in this country to understand about race and racism?
Um, I think it's difficult for a lot of people to understand like this concept of intersectionality where even within marginalized groups, there are certain privileges that people have. Like, for example, within like the Asian community or the Black community or really any sort of like racial minority, you like your the way you identify with your gender can also impact how people treat you. So on top of like experiencing aggressions based on your race, it's also about your gender. And so then it's like this layered conversation about how your race and all these other aspects about your identity affect how people treat you rather than it just being a race conversation. I think that makes it difficult for people to talk about it because then it's like people want to simplify it down just to race, but it can be a lot of factors impacting how people treat you aside from just that.
So you're saying like a lot of people just think that it's just like, oh, because you're Asian or because you're black, like that's the reason you're experiencing discrimination. But in actuality, gender plays a part of it, religion plays a part of it, your sexual preference plays a part of it. Like all these different factors that make up your intersectionality is kind of what makes discrimination unique to every person. It's not just race, it's
Yeah.
all these different factors. Okay.
Yeah.
So, how were your thoughts and beliefs about race and racism formed, whether that be through like social media or your past experiences with your family and friends, pretty much anything.
Um, I think it's a culmination of things. I mean, for one, just being in Gen Z, we have like such we can connect with so many people through social media. And so then it's like everyone's sharing their story, their experiences. And from there, you can kind of educate yourself and like also just the news being through social media. Like there's so much information out there. And then also just my experiences with my family. So on my dad's side, um, I'm Korean. And then on my mom's side, I'm white. So like being biracial, I think also affected my beliefs about racism and like racial inequality. Um, I mean, I think everyone also just has their own experiences with it, especially if you are like a minority, because it may not be like you may not have terrible experiences, but there are microaggressions and like stereotypes that people expect you to play, even if it's not obvious. It's kind of this expected behavior from you. And so when you
hmm
don't deliver on that, um, I mean, it can kind of change people's perception of like who you are and like what your identity is.
So, do you think, at least in your personal experience, have you experienced more like macro aggressions of people like outright being racist, or do you just experience like little comments that kind of like chip away at you? It's like they're not trying to be racist, but it comes across as racist.
I think for me, it's it's definitely microaggressions. And even at that, I'm not offended by things that people say because most of the time I take it as like a lack of education on their part. And so what really frustrates me is like them not being open to like a conversation or like a correction about it, or like I try to not necessarily call them out but just speak about it a bit more, like the event that might have occurred between us. And sometimes people don't have like the information to really hold that conversation or the attitude to like be open to it.
hmm And just in general, do you think social media has kind of helped the fight against racism, or do you think it's worsened it, or do you think maybe it's done a bit of both?
It's definitely both. um I think a big issue is that people think that if we kind of tackle these topics on social media, it's you can replace like real work done through legislation and like protesting. And like I think you have to approach social media as something that kind of supplements the fight rather than like is like the forefront of the battle or something. Because
Hmm.
I mean, a few years ago with George Floyd, people were posting like black pictures or like just like a black screen on their feed, and there's like a big conversation about whether that was actually helpful for the movement. And on one end, it might have opened somebody's eyes to this issue, but on the other end, it's like how much is posting about it really helping? Whereas like if our efforts were directed towards funding sort of like organizations that are going to government and like our representatives about it,
Hmm.
you know. So I think it's definitely both.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. So, what's one race-based topic that you wish more people talked about or understood today? It
Mm,
can be anything.
I think that when we talk about America specifically, um, I think it's best that people understand that when we're talking about a race issue, we're also talking about a class issue because of like the institutions that have been big players historically, like slavery and like the oppression of Native Americans and stuff. So it's definitely these two issues are hand in hand. Like if someone's lower class and they're also lower race, then we have to approach both problems and how they relate to each other.
Hmm. So, do you think, based on just your answer, do you think that it's more that in America we have kind of like this institutionalized racism where it's kind of like systematic, where these ideas are kind of built into the American system? Like you use the example of slavery, and it's like, yeah, we've strayed away from that today, but there's still evidence of like the effects that slavery has left behind on today's society with race and class and how those kind of work with each other. So is that what you're kind of like hinting at, in that sense that it's more of like a systematic issue rather than like an individualistic issue?
Oh, for sure. I mean, even whenever like we ended slavery, we still had the huge civil rights movement afterwards because um the politicians or the representatives in certain states or certain areas still wanted to implement policies that may not have specifically stated that they were racially targeting people, but it was definitely, targeting a
Hmm.
certain group of people who were either lower class or black African Americans or just any sort of minority group. And so I would say there's definitely systems that may not obviously be committing like heinous racist like acts, but there's a history that's involved, and so we have to like be able to see that.
Hmm. And so that those are all the questions I have, but I don't know if you're in a sociology class right now or not, but I thought you gave like really good insight into a lot of these questions. So yeah, that's all the questions I have, and thank you.
Yeah, okay, no problem.